Here's my student ID. And my name is Taylor Vaughn, and I'm here to give a speech today on genetically modified crops, deliberative dialogue, part 2. Alright, so both of the videos that I watched stated that they were unsure if they were fully for or against genetically modified crops, and they both brought up some great points on each side of the argument, which made me aware of some aspects of GM crops that I had not previously given much thought to before giving my speech, and gave me some new information to continue my research and further develop my stake on this issue, such as the threats to the small farmers, the cost to research the potential threats of genetically modified organisms, the potential risks for people with allergies, and the hazard it can cause to the insects. A specific point brought up by Natalie was the cost to research the risks of GM crops. I performed an experiment in genetics this last semester over the cost of GM crops, but failed to mention that in my first speech. This made me think of what Dr. Maiden mentioned in lab about not only the expense of testing the new crops and making sure they are safe for consumption, but also the very inefficient, costly, and time-consuming process it takes to create a successful genetically modified crop. A new genetically modified crop will take millions of dollars and around 6 to 15 years before the crop is able to reach the market. That fact was obtained from my lab guide that I saved, written by Dr. Stephanie Maiden. Another very interesting point mentioned in their speeches was that the threat to the small farmer. I really hadn't given any thought to that because I didn't know it really would affect the small farmer. But this was a very good point in staking an opinion against genetically modified crops. However, I personally feel like genetically modified crops are helping more people than they would be hurting. For example, in my previous speech, I mentioned that scientists are able to increase the crop yield of specific plants that are in a higher demand, such as wheat and corn, which is in a lot of our foods that we eat. This is necessary, like the higher crop yield is necessary, due to the exponential growth of the world's population. These plants are needed in a higher demand, and instead of taking up more farming land and potentially having effects on the environment that are negative, GM crops can be produced at a faster rate and in larger quantities. This, in a sense, would be helping to alleviate world hunger, helping a lot more people than maybe just a couple farmers. Another specific example of GM crops helping a large group of people is adding nutritional value to foods such as vitamin A and white rice for the people of the Philippines. They would before suffer from nutritional deficiencies, but with the help of GM crops, they are able to get the right nutrients they need in their food. Also, GM crops can be planted on previously unfarmable land, so also again helping the environment and the people. I could go on and list more reasons why I believe GM crops are more beneficial to society, even though it may hurt the small farmers. And maybe there's a possible solution to the problem where GM crops could be available to the third world countries that need it the most, and maybe not be as widespread in the areas who are not suffering from nutritional deficiencies and having too low of a food supply. Like maybe throughout America there could be we could go without some of the genetically modified foods, but I don't know, there's other benefits as well as helping the environment. It's another thing you have to think of. Another point that I thought was very good, brought up by Lauren, was that GM crops should always be labeled, and there should be two options for people who are avidly against GM foods. If you don't want to buy them, if you don't want to eat them, you shouldn't have to. I think that there may be a current law in place, I think someone said that in their speech, which requires food to be labeled when containing GMOs, but I'm not totally for sure, but I really think it'd be a good idea to have both options available in stores. Also, with the threat to the insects, they're talking about superbugs that could become resistant to pesticides and herbicides we'd be creating these new strain of bugs that we wouldn't be able to fight off with our herbicides and pesticides, and who knows what could happen. And also people with allergies can really affect them in other ways. So, There's a lot of things you have to think of, but after listening to both of these speeches, there were some very interesting points brought up as to why they were still on the fence about GM crops. However, I am still leaning more towards being in complete favor for them as long as research is still being done to ensure that GM crops are necessary and are the right decision in helping society's growing demands of food.